Ой, поля, ви широкі поля, що ми на вас же поля, й урожаю нема.
Пана хазяїна, та й на його дворі щедрий вечори, щедрий вечори, та й на його дворі, та й на винограді, щедрий вечори, щедрий вечори, твоя лавежа, домника висока, щедрий вечори, щедрий вечори, домника висока, листа широка, щедрий вечор. Добрий вечір!
What you heard was the trailer for Counting Sheep, the 2016 interactive folk opera by Mark and Marichka Marchik, the husband and wife musical team behind the Lemon Bucket Orchestra. They met and fell in love in Kyiv, Ukraine, on Maidan Square during the Revolution of Dignity, also known as EuroMaidan. Counting Sheep tells their intimate story of revolution in one of the most breathtaking live shows I've ever seen. We'll link to the trailer in the show notes for you to see what I mean. It's a powerful reminder that art is essential to our victory. If you have a song you'd like us to feature on Gaslit Nation, we want to hear from you. You'll find a link at the top of the show notes on how to submit your music. It's easy, it's fun, and we love showcasing the work of our listeners. The world needs its artists now more than ever, so keep creating and keep shining. To introduce this week's guest, we're taking you back to one of the very first episodes of Gaslit Nation, where we examined the 2016 election as a crime scene because that's exactly what it was. Anyone serious about defeating the oligarchy must understand that Ukraine is central to this fight. Ukrainian journalists and anti-corruption reformers are among our greatest allies. If you're not amplifying Ukraine's struggle for democracy, you're not serious about winning the battle for our own. Here's a montage from one of our earliest shows, setting the stage for our conversation with this week's guest, historian Marci Shore, author of The Ukrainian Night, An Intimate History of Revolution, on how America can spark its own revolution of dignity. To fully appreciate what happens in August 2016, we have to go back to November 2013, to Ukraine. Viktor Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine, who came to power with Manafort's help, who was closely advised by Manafort, rejects signing the EU Association Agreement, which would help integrate Ukraine into Europe politically and economically. Instead, he accepts a $15 billion bailout from Russia. What happens next changes history. A young Afghani-born investigative journalist by the name of Mustafa Nayyem launches a revolution through a Facebook post, calling everyone out to the Maidan, the main square in Kyiv. Over the next 3 months, December through February, in the freezing cold, protesters risked their lives facing off with riot police and government snipers, all under the banner of not wanting to be a Russian proxy state. Dozens of protesters are killed. EU officials come in to broker a peace deal. Vitaly Klitschko, the heavyweight champion of the world, who has joined the revolution, is on stage to deliver the news that a peace deal has been reached. Yanukovych can stay in power, and then there'll be an election at the end of the year. A guy in his 20s comes up from the crowd, grabs the mic from the heavyweight champion of the world.
Перша вимога, мого побратима з Яворівщини.
And says that his friend was killed in the protests, leaving behind a wife and child. The president has until 10 a.m. to leave, or they'll make him leave. The next morning, Yanukovych is gone. He's fled to Russia. That spring, there are new elections. Mustafa Nayyem, the investigative journalist that launched the revolution, gets elected in a parliament, and so does his close friend, an investigative journalist he often works with, by the name of Serhiy Leshchenko, who in August 2016 comes crashing into our election in a very big way. Okay, so August, something big happens. Sergei Leshchenko alerted the New York Times of a book that was found with handwritten payments down to Yanukovych's people, including his image maker, his confidant, his hand of the king, Paul Manafort. And this became known as the secret ledger story. It ran in the New York Times in August 14, and this is what it had to say. Handwritten ledgers show $12.7 million in undisclosed cash payments designated for Mr. Manafort from Mr. Yanukovych's pro-Russian political party from 2007 to 2012, according to Ukraine's newly formed National Anti-Corruption Bureau. Investigators assert that the disbursements were part of an illegal off-the-books system whose recipients also included election officials. In addition, criminal prosecutors are investigating a group of offshore shell companies that help members of Mr. Yanukovych's inner circle finance their lavish lifestyles, including a palatial presidential residence with a private zoo, golf course, and tennis court. Among the hundreds of murky transactions these companies engaged in was an $18 million deal to sell Ukrainian cable television assets to a partnership put together by Mr. Manafort and a Russian oligarch, Oleg Deripaska, close ally of President Vladimir Putin. Today's guest is Marci Shore, a distinguished historian, writer, and thinker who brings the past to life with profound humanity. Marci holds the chair in European Intellectual History at the University of Toronto and is a professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. She is also the acclaimed author of the must-read book, The Ukrainian Night, An Intimate History of Revolution, a deeply moving chronicle of Ukraine's 2014 revolution of dignity and the people who risked everything to reclaim their future. Her work bridges the worlds of philosophy, politics, and personal testimony, reminding us how history is never just about the past, but about who we choose to be now. Thank you so much for being here, Marci. Welcome to Gaslit Nation.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Andrea. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, you're just back from Ukraine and you saw our dear friend Terrell Starr in Ukraine. How was your trip?
It was fantastic. It was wonderful. I was so happy Terrell came, by the way. I was in Ukraine this time because the wonderful editor, publisher, and translator, writer Oksana Faustina and I were the guest curators this year for the Kyiv Book Arsenal, which is the largest literary festival in Ukraine. And we got to choose a theme, and our theme was Everything is Translation. And Terrell was there in the context of a panel we had put together called Building Bridges, which was precisely about how, especially at moments of historical extremity and grotesque suffering, can you reach across borders to people from radically different cultural context, political context, and try to find moments of understanding and solidarity. So I was delighted.
What did you guys discover? Like, tell us.
Well, we discovered that it involves a lot of self-reflection. Like, one of the things Terrell was talking about is, what does it mean for him to be a Black American reporter in Ukraine and then going back to the States and trying to reach out to a Black American audience, to his own people, to a community in Detroit that is undergoing a lot of their own suffering and get them to empathize with what Ukrainians are going through. What does it mean for him that Ukrainians who are undergoing a war in which they are being treated as colonial objects by Russia can come to his country and be privileged vis-a-vis Black Americans because they're white? How do you negotiate, all of these different layers? Natalka Gumanyuk, who is really one of the great women of the 21st century, he's also a phenomenal war journalist and human rights activist and human rights crime documenter.
Yeah, we've had her on the show.
Oh, okay. So you all know.
I'll link to that
Natalka.
interview with her in the show notes.
Yes, no, please do. Because one of the things that she's been doing really remarkably too since the full-scale invasion is going around to Asia, to Africa, to Latin America, and trying to build these bridges and saying, what does it mean to try to create a bridge of empathy to what Ukrainians are going to in the global South when you're arriving in places where people there have been through extraordinary suffering that Ukrainians know nothing about or Americans know nothing about? What is the basis? And one of the arguments she was making is that these concepts and constructs that intellectuals like to use about colonialism and imperialism and post-colonialism and fascism and neo-totalitarianism, that does not speak to real people. You have to start with the basis of experience. You have to start with having real people speak to one another about very empirical personal experience. What does it mean for one victim of torture, of electrocution, to encounter another, who went through some similar experience in radically different circumstances, in a radically different political setting, but there was something irreducibly personal, and torturous about that creates a bridge to understanding. And so Natalka's like, you put the concepts aside and you go to experience, you go to human experience. And that's our chance for connection.
Wow. So one thing that all of us can relate to, no matter where we're from around the world, is the oligarchy. The New Yorker in early June has this damning piece looking at the breathtaking scope of corruption by our oligarch in chief, all of the illegal money grabs that are enriching him and his family. Don Jr., David Sachs, that whole crew, they're starting this private club that's members only need like $500,000 to join, called the executive branch. The executive branch. So they're literally selling membership into this White House. And at their parties are cabinet officials and their staff. This is corruption that America has never seen. It dwarfs all other chapters of deeply corrupt crimes. And it's very reminiscent of the Trumpian, Ukrainian Trump, Viktor Yanukovych and his family, and the extreme wealth that was building up before Ukrainians took to the streets in a popular uprising known as EuroMaidan, the Revolution of Dignity, which you, of course, wrote an extraordinarily intimate, powerful book about, the Ukrainian Night, and you updated it for today with the war and where we are now with the people that you followed for your book. Could you, one of the questions I get a lot from Gaslit Nation listeners is like, what do we do? The oligarchy is entrenched. They have us by the neck. How can we do an American Maidan? And I think there's some factors that really worked for Ukrainians that I don't see can be recreated here. But could you walk us through what Ukrainians did, average, everyday Ukrainians did with Euromaidan, and give us some insight into what lessons we as Americans in this moment of crisis can take from that and learn from that?
Yes. There was so much in that question.
Oh, yes. It was a therapeutic question.
I was taking notes as you were talking. Okay,
it was like that moment in Star Wars, like, help us, Obi-Wan Kenobi, your only hope.
Yes, I fear I'm less competent at creating solutions than I am at historical analysis. But let me maybe step back and start with the first part of the question and give you some of my insights as a historian of Eastern Europe into the oligarchy problem. So one of the things that we've seen coming up out of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of this kind of oligarchy in Russia is that, of course, there have always been people with more money and people with less money. We're transitioning to capitalism. And of course, you can argue that inequities and differences in wealth is the price one pays for freedom. And when people try to level out everything and make us into a purely egalitarian society, then we got communist terror. Now, one of the things that Hegel tells us that I think is actually very relevant here is that changes in scale can become changes in kind, that quantitative changes can become qualitative changes. So it's one thing to say, okay, there are going to be differences in wealth. Now, differences in wealth is one thing. Somebody is making $50,000 a year. Someone's making $75,000 a year. Someone's making $80,000 a year. Now, what happens when some huge percentage of a country's resources are concentrated in the hands of a tiny number of people? Now, you've moved from quantity to quality. You've moved from a change in scale to a change in kind. It's not just like, well, we have a 2-room apartment, you have a 3-room apartment. It's like we can buy the whole country, and you're not able to feed your children. And there's something, when it becomes grotesque, Hegel's insight was, it's not just a matter of scale. We're in a different kind of phenomenon. And that's something I think we were kind of learning from places like Russia and Ukraine, that Americans didn't understand at first, like what oligarchy was. Because like, okay, yes, there are rich people, there are poor people, there are middle-class people. But what happens when you just have some grotesque percentage of the wealth in the hands of a very, very small number of people? I don't think Americans we hadn't gotten our minds around it. Also because of something that Ivan Krastyev points out in a recent Financial Times piece, which I completely agree with. The amounts of money are too big to get our minds around. I mean, I'm not very good with money in general, but, if you say, okay, like this pizza costs $15. If you pay that $25, you can get much better pizza. I'm coming from New Haven, so like pizza is a big thing. Like if you pay $25, you can really get the best pizza in the world. And so you have an intuitive sense of what that $10 is. Once you're in the realm of $10 billion, who has an intuitive sense of what $10 billion is? It's too much money. It's an abstraction for us, and so we can't really get our minds around it. And that also, is a part of the vulnerability. And then there are these people like Paul Manafort, our little like boutique industry for gangsters with presidential ambitions, which of course was how Yanukovych got himself elected, because he realizes that we have this, boutique industry for gangsters with presidential ambitions. And he gets Paul Manafort to fly out to Ukraine, not speaking Ukrainian, not speaking Russian, but playing golf with him, giving him a new haircut, teaching him a couple TV tricks. I personally didn't see a big difference, but this actually gets this gangster, Ukrainian previously discredited presidential candidate who had tried to poison his opponent with dioxin and cheated in the last elections, gets him elected. And when Trump comes out on the scene in 2015, 2016, well, so to kind of back up at the end of EuroMaidan, I'm doing the thing historians should never do, which is not go in chronological order. I'll go back to what that revolution was about. But, there was a sniper massacre. There were over 100 people who were killed, and there was a ceasefire negotiated largely by then Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski. And Yanukovych, the gangster, brutal dictator, flees across the border to Russia. At that point, Paul Manafort, his PR guy, is out of a job. And we know what he does next. He comes back to the States, and he goes to work for Donald Trump. And Frank Foer, who I had met in Kyiv in 2014, and who had been following this story of Yanukovych and Manafort and how Yanukovych could possibly have come back to power. He writes this piece. It was probably early 2016, if I'm remembering correctly. And he says, you all don't think Trump can win. You don't know Paul Manafort. This guy can get him elected. And I read that and I had this chilling fear that Frank was right, that this was actually the case. And so one thing I say is we're learning from one another. Like we're now in this very global environment, right? Like Frank understood the threat of Trump much earlier before most Americans were taking it seriously, including people in the opposition that just seemed too crazy to be real because he had been following what was going on with Russia and Ukraine. Now, the other thing that was happening in Russia that I think is relevant to this kleptocracy oligarchy we're finding ourselves in was an innovation of Putin's spin doctors, people like Surkov and Gleb Pavlovsky, the postmodern spin doctors, and not only are they playing with what we now call post-truth, but they're also playing with what in Slavic languages you would call obnaženia, this kind of laying bare. So you don't try to hide the corruption anymore. You don't try to hide the lawlessness. You don't try to hide the violence. You don't try to hide the lies. It's all right there on the surface. Surkov has this kind of chilling line where he says that, all of these inelegant parts of our system are right there, right on the surface, not hidden by any kind of architectural excesses, and that laying bare, that failure to conceal, I think paradoxically disempowers people like us in the opposition, because you spend your time running around trying to find the thing that's hidden, that's been concealed from you. I think this was the problem with our hope in the Mueller report, when really everything that is grotesque is thrown right out there, right in front of your face. Trump tells us who he is every single day. The whole, cryptocurrency, let's have the private party, it's right there. It's right there. It doesn't need to be uncovered. And it's so obvious and so thrown in your face that paradoxically, we don't know what to do with that because it seems insane that could be the case. And I think if I understood how much of a threat that could be with Trump earlier than most Americans. And I was terrified by the end of 2015. I think before most people were really taking that seriously. It was not because, I was any smarter than, my fellow Americans, but because I was watching what was happening in Russia and Ukraine. So this kind of the post-truth, the laying bare, the what oligarchy means in terms of grotesque, unimaginable differences in wealth, the role of people like Manafort. I had a head start because I was watching what was going on over there. And Americans tend to think that, we're the avant-garde, so Eastern Europe is always going to try to be catching up with us. But in this case, alas, it was rather that things were coming from east to west. The whole innovation of you can have a troll factory to create, alternative realities and influence elections. That's coming from Petersburg. They try it out in Ukraine and then we get Pizzagate, with Hillary Clinton, and so I was following from that direction, watching from afar that revolution in Ukraine in 2013, 2014 was extraordinary. I mean, it is a moment I continue to cling to because it was such a moment of hope, and a moment of a revelation of the human capacity to do something good. And of the various lessons that we learn there, first of all, when people first come out in November 2013 to protest Yanukovych's 11th hour refusal to sign an association agreement with the EU, nobody is thinking we're going to die here. Nobody is thinking we're going to lay down our lives. This is it. It's all or nothing. You have a whole bunch of students, mostly young people, for whom whether or not Europe is open to Ukraine had huge significance. And it had disproportionate significance depending on how old you were. Right? If you were already on a pension and you didn't really have much money, whether or not the borders of Europe were going to be open to you, whether or not you could go on educational exchanges or do internships in Brussels, probably was not going to affect your life very much. But if you were an ambitious, energetic, enthusiastic 15, 18, 20, 25-year-old, it was everything. Was the world going to be open to you? And so it was disproportionately young people who were, young, probably idealistic. They were nonviolent. They were holding hands. They were singing. They were saying Ukraine is Europe. Nobody was thinking we're going to die here. And one of the lessons of that revolution was how unexpected things can happen and people can change. And they can change really quickly. And I think for me, the moment that blew my mind away as a historian, where these were young people. Protest movements belong to young people. You are supposed to be out there protesting when you're 18 or 22. If you're already cynical by that time, something has gone wrong. You should be out there, right? You should be out there with your friends. You should be holding hands and singing. That's what you should be doing. And Yanukovych, gets his goons, Berkut, these riot police thugs, to brutally beat up the people on the square, on the Maidan, which is the huge square in the center of Kyiv, after about 10 days. And he really used large-scale violence, not quite enough to kill anyone, although it was borderline, but enough to terrify people, because that kind of large-scale violence by the government towards its own population had not happened since 1991. And presumably he was thinking that, okay, now the parents are going to freak out and they're going to pull their kids off the streets, which was a reasonable thing to think. I mean, rationally, it was reasonable to think. I say this as a parent, I would probably pull my kid off the street. But that was when something really extraordinary happens, because instead of pulling their kids off the streets, the parents join them there. And you go from having several hundred or a couple thousand people on the square to a day and a half later, you have between 500,000 and 1 million people in the streets of Kyiv. No one has ever seen that many people on the streets of Kyiv. And now they're not just shouting, Ukraine is Europe. Now it's, we will not permit you to beat our children. And that was it. That was what Vasyl Cherepanin says. That was when EuroMaidan becomes just Maidan. And it's no longer just about the EU, and it's no longer just about the students. It's this impassioned revolt, against being treated as an object and not a subject, against this assault on human life and human dignity. I mean, as a historian who knows how many revolutions have been applauded as Oedipal revolts, each generation rising up against the fathers in their turn, to see this kind of overcoming of Oedipal revolt. I mean, Hegel would call it Aufhebung, this kind of dialectical sublation when the parents come out and they join their kids. I did an interview with the writer Taras Prohasko, whose son was there. And he talks about how he was hysterically trying to find him. He wasn't answering the phone, and when he finally finds his son, and realizes he's okay, he gets in his car and drives hours and hours from Ivano-Frankivsk to Kiev, but not to pull Markian off the street and bring him home, but to join him there. And that was an amazing moment. I was in Vienna at the time. I wasn't there, but I was like, wow, like something historically has turned, and and the violence then increased, it increased gradually throughout the winter. And the amazing thing too was that I would say by the second half of January, even from a distance, you could feel almost palpably that something had turned and a critical mass of people had made a decision that they were willing to die there if need be. And that was not true, in November, and it was true by the end of January. And that was to have a society, to have that number of people undergoing that kind of transformation. One, it's testimony to the fact that people can change. Societies can change. People can find in themselves things they would not have expected of themselves, which is a source of hope for all of us. Ukraine after the Maidan was not the same country as it was beforehand, and that plays out to the present day. I mean, for me, that was incredibly inspiring. And the other thing that you saw it involved for revolution to work, it's extraordinary it ever works. Hannah Arendt speaks about the lost treasure of revolution. You need a critical mass of people crossing to the other side of fear in solidarity with one another at the same time, overcoming all possible collective action problems. And it's a miracle that ever happens, but it occasionally does. It occasionally does. And the fact that it does shows that we human beings are capable of it. And it shows the miracle of solidarity as the antidote to atomization. Tyrannical regimes feed on atomization. They create situations of arbitrariness. This is another one of these Slavic words, произвол in Russian. Arbitrariness, which is always tinged with tyranny and a bit of terror. You don't know who will be next. And you see the Trump administration using this already, right? Like guys in balaclavas come like to take away a student off the street. Why this person in particular? Well, you don't know. You don't know who's going to be next. There are no rules. There's no necessarily a pattern. There's no more rule of law. And the fact, the very arbitrariness atomizes people because nobody knows where on which side of the line it's actually safe, and people retreat into themselves and they put their heads down and they try not to be noticed. So that atomization is a tool of all tyrannical regimes. And the only possible antidote for that is a really extraordinary kind of solidarity that it's a miracle when it ever happens, because it involves this kind of transcendent moment of a critical mass of people going beyond what they possibly could have thought they were capable of doing. And when I saw that in Ukraine, I thought, wow, that is just a reminder that even if that kind of solidarity happens very, very rarely in history, even if it has only ever happened for a flicker of a second, the fact that it can happen at all means that somehow we human beings have that in us. We somehow have that capacity, and we have to cling to that hope.
Completely, all of that. And so with Ukrainians, and I think if people think, oh, Ukrainians are just so good at uniting, no, there's a saying in the Ukrainian diaspora that if you want to start two clubs among Ukrainians, you start one. And the thing that united them all was Russia. Like, they were all united in Russia. Like, I interviewed people on the square that were like, Yanukovych was aligned with Russia, backed by Russia. And even if it was like a wealthy Ukrainian, they would still say what they did to my grandmother under Stalin, under the Soviets. So there was this, what united Ukrainians in this collective show of force was Russia. And in America today, Americans are split on Russia. You have an alarming number of conservatives, Republicans, who see Russia as, a partner. And then we can't even get united on the oligarchy. So I don't know what it would take to unite Americans other than Trump, the oligarch in chief, convicted felon, 47. Like if he just destroyed so many lives that he becomes the new Russia, and that's what we all unite on.
No, it's an excellent question. I would say that in the Maidan, now it's definitely Russia. My friend Jirko Prohasko, who's a protagonist in that book, he uses a German phrase. He's like, it's not hatred I have for the Russians. It's contempt. It's something worse than hatred. It's this kind of disdain that people for no reason have just come to kill us. I think that was less true during the Maidan. I think it was less Russia, in general, which it has become now that the country is filled with Russian soldiers carrying out mass atrocity. But at the time, it was the particular kind of tyranny represented by the Putinist regime,
right,
who was supporting Yanukovych.
Exactly. That's another word
kind
of Russia.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Like that version. Like there was really, there was a sense that we're going to be united against rule by gangsters, which is what this was. I mean, oligarchy is essentially ruled by gangsters, right? And that was tremendously unifying because it wasn't just corruption. And there's another word I like to use that in Ukrainian is prodajnist, in Russian is prodajnost, the saleability. This quality that anyone can be bought or sold. Everyone has a price. Are you saleable? Can you be bought off? And there was a sense that oligarchy was connected to, it's another word for corruption, but it's larger than corruption because it's also a kind of existential character trait. Like, can you be purchased? Do you have a price? And there was really a revolt against this people being considered as things that can be bought or sold. So not just individual acts of corruption, like this corruption has resulted in this oligarch stealing all this wealth from the country, but also this idea that the dehumanizing and demeaning and humiliation, of being in a world in which people are treated as not having dignity, as not being responsible actors, but just being commodities or pawns that can be bought or sold. And I think there was a real existential element to that kind of revolt. And when the Ukrainians called the EuroMaidan the revolution of dignity, they really meant dignity in that Kantian sense. When Kant says anything that can be, exchanged for something of equivalent value has a price. Anything that is beyond all exchange and in midst of no equivalent has dignity. Human beings are distinguished, in that we have dignity. It was the dignity of being a subject and not an object, of being a person and not a thing. And that was tremendously inspiring.
Oh, absolutely. And in terms of where they are now, because I know you updated your book, The Ukrainian Night, for today's war. Tell us, because what people have to understand that after these young people fought back against government snipers, Kyiv, Maidan Square was on fire. Many of them then joined volunteer battalions to defend their nation against Russia's invasion of Donbass, eastern Ukraine. So Russia seized Crimea, invades Donbass to punish Ukraine for its popular uprising that overthrew their Ukrainian Trump, sending him running to Russia, where he remains to this day, waiting for the American Trump to join him. So tell us what happened to some of the people that you followed in your book in terms of today's war.
Well, different things happen to different characters. I try in the introduction, in the new preface that I wrote for the paperback edition, to follow some of these characters through into the war. Like the Misha Martinenko, who I opened the book with, who was a young student at the time, who was fighting on the Maidan in the bloodiest days during the sniper massacre. He didn't think he was going to survive. He did survive. There's a scene that I tell in the beginning of the book where this girl he had just met in Lviv calls him during these battles, and says goodbye to him, and he thinks this is goodbye, but he survives. He goes to Lviv. He marries her. It's very like that part of the story is very beautiful. There's some very beautiful pictures. Now they have a baby, which is also very exciting, but Misha's back in the army, and he volunteered, immediately in 2022. With a sense of obligation. Jirko Prohasko, who is one of the protagonists in the book, whose son at the time, his older son was 11 during the Euromaidan, and after the first death had pleaded with his father, not to go back, and he is now old enough to be drafted himself. Markian is also serving in the army. His nephew, who the father, Taras Prohasko, who went from Ivano-Frankivsk to Kyiv to find Markian to join him on the streets. Markian is now serving in the army, although he wasn't assigned to the front. One of the things I was very interested in this book, as a historian who's worked a lot with the category of generations. Generation is a very interesting character for historians because philosophers tend to move from the level of the individual to the universal, whereas historians like to move on these middle mediating layers, be they class, ethnicity, nation, religion. I like the lens of generation for various reasons. It cuts across class, nation, ethnicity, all sorts of other things, but also has a kind of biological irreducibility to it. The time which you were born cannot be altered. It's not a question of choice. And the age you were when at the moment of a dramatic historical event really is formative. There's a bit of a Freudian thing here too. Like whether you were 10 or 15 or 25 or 85 in 1989, that really made a difference. So I was very interested in this book also in different generations of the same family who went to the Maidan together. And two of the people I interviewed were Roman and Taras Ratushny. And Roman was 16 at the time of the Maidan. He wasn't even a university student. He was a high school student. He was a kid living with his mother, who was also a very well-known writer. And he was one of the kids who was brutally beaten up that first night when, at the end of November, when Yanukovych sent out Berkut. And
the riot police. That was the very start of what would become the revolution.
Exactly. Yes. So he was there that night. His shoulder gets battered in. So I was interviewing him together with his father, Taras, who was also there the whole time and doing a lot of reporting. He's a journalist. And I said to Roman, I said, your mother must have been very upset, but she let you go back. And he said, my mother was making Molotov cocktails on Rushevskova Street. That whole family was very involved. And in February 2022, Roman, he was 16 at that time, so he was 24 in 2022, he immediately volunteered. He went to the front. He was in the middle of some very complex operation in late spring 2022, and he was killed. And he was the first, of the people I knew who was, killed in the war. And Katya Mishenko, who was the person who had originally introduced us, sent me a message, and she said, unfortunately, and he was really among the best of his generation. He had become an environmentalist activist. In the interim, he was campaigning to save a park in his neighborhood. He was very socially engaged. He was very brave. He was very smart. He had a wonderful family, brother, father, mother, everybody loved him. He was all really impressive people. He was killed very early. More recently, his brother was also killed. And I can't imagine, I think about his mother, who I don't know personally, who I've read a lot about all the time. I think I would lose my mind. The mother was also a friend of Victoria Amelina, so you can read about her in Vika's posthumously published book about writing about women, writing about war. Vika was a novelist in her late 30s with a son who was doing war crimes research and documentation from the very beginning of the full-scale invasion. And she was killed in the summer of 2023 in Kramatorsk, when the Russians sent a missile to the pizza place where she was with two Latin American colleagues whom she was taking close to the front to see the war. It's completely grotesque to see how the country is bleeding so many of its best people and just so many of its people. And all for what? For some kind of sick fantasy, in the mind of an aging dictator.
Oligarchy. It's all the oligarchy, the global oligarchy. Yeah. So I wanted to ask you also, so you mentioned Paul Manafort, who made all of this grotesque mass murder possible. And my sister, along with, of course, with Frank Foer, who she connected with, my sister was very early in warning whoever would listen, Democratic leadership, Republicans, the media, about Trump and Russia, that if Paul Manafort was managing Trump's campaign, that meant the Kremlin was managing Trump's campaign. And she stuck her neck out and she paid a horrible price. She was harassed by MAGA disinformation, including Fox News, Sean Hannity, Tucker Carlson. And then the Kremlin versions of that went on Kremlin State TV, went after her. Her home was broken into, car broken into, computers hacked, her child's phone hacked, horrible, horrible stuff. And then she was put under all these bogus investigations under Trump And she testified for 9 hours in a skiff for the bipartisan Senate intelligence report, which turned out to be a very good report. So she paid a very horrible price. And your husband, Tim Snyder, who we've had on the show 3 times, wrote a very sweet email to me during that nightmare. Very kind message from Tim. And so one tension in my family towards when we finally got Biden in and you think things are going to clear up for us, my sister then decides to move abroad. She relocated with her family abroad. I ruined Christmas before she left by getting very mad at everyone at the dinner table that my sister was leaving. Granted, I was also very pregnant and hormonal. So I had so I forgive myself. Whether my sister does, I'm not sure. But so it was a very tense time because our family was separating. I have little girls and I wanted them to grow up with their cousins, but now they can't. And it just felt like such a painful separation of our 2 families. But she had to make that decision for herself and what was best for her and her family. And it turned out to be the best thing ever. It was exactly what they needed. And I know that now and I see that now, but it was very hard. And so obviously, when I got the news from a mutual friend that you and Tim had left to Toronto, my first reaction was, good, we need them in Toronto. Because Toronto is one of the most Ukrainian cities outside of Ukraine. It makes perfect sense that you're there, given how much, you and Tim devote to in ringing the alarm and for Ukraine especially. And so it makes sense. But then when the news broke internationally, people treated it like screaming fire in a crowded theater. And then suddenly everyone's packing up and leaving. So one of the questions I get from our listeners, do we stay or do we go? And one listener pointed out that the optimist stayed in Germany. And so it is a big tension because not everyone can leave, obviously. And then you have the phenomenon of all the Russians who have been leaving ever since Putin has really been tightening the screws on them. But they don't really do much when they get abroad. They just hide. And you see that when you go to Razum's events, Razum for Ukraine, a big humanitarian organization, you see a lot of Ukrainians, a lot of Georgians, a lot of Poles, some Russians, yes, but you don't see Russians organizing abroad in the level that we know are there, right? And so I guess I'm on the side of, after a lot of reflection, do what's best. Because from what I've seen with my sister's story, of course, do what you need to do for yourself. But wherever you go, don't stop fighting. So for my listeners who are very anxious, some are anxious, some can't go because maybe they have dependents, aging family members that can't go. There's all sorts of reasons why people can't go. So I want to just for you to comment on that. Just what advice do you have for people, when they should finally personally make that decision for themselves?
I'm probably completely unqualified to give advice. I mean, Tim and I vacillated for years about the monk school offers at Toronto. I was a bit baffled and kind of blown away that this became an international news story.
I blame Jason Stanley, but go on.
It's totally Jason's fault. I love him dearly. But yes, when Jason decided to take this offer and join us, then Jason's, whole way of being in the world created this. But Jason actually did decide quite suddenly after the inauguration, after Columbia's capitulation. So, I mean, it really was a different story for him. I mean, for me and Tim, we had been contemplating and musing over these offers from the monk school for a couple of years. It was not a sudden thing after the elections or, after the inauguration. We had already come to Toronto on sabbatical to kind of check out the situation in August. We were here for the elections. It's very likely we would have stayed even if Kamala Harris had won. We were thinking about things like, schools for the kids, and there's a wider range of options in Toronto than there is in New Haven. I mean, it was a big thing for our family, but it wasn't necessarily completely politically connected. I mean, it was in the sense that I, for years, wanted to get my kids out of the States before high school, in part because I was so anxious about the gun violence.
Of course.
And Yale is, half an hour, 45 minutes from Sandy Hook. My kids were really small at the time of the Sandy Hook massacre. I'm a neurotic Jew. I have a lot of
trauma in your DNA.
Yes, I have trauma in my DNA. I'm terrified of guns. There are a lot of shootings in New Haven. So independently of the political situation, I had studied in Toronto in the 90s. I really liked it. We contemplated going to Europe permanently, but there was also a sense Toronto would be closer to the States and to parents and family. And so it was not very dramatic in that sense. Like, it was not a political drama in our lives in the same way. But of course, the timing created a sense of it being a great political drama, which I then felt very guilty about because, after Trump won the election, I definitely did not want to go back to the States, and I definitely did not want my kids back there. Like, I felt like I've thrown everything like I have to give at this since the 2016 elections. My first impulse was to leave the day after the 2016 elections. I'm a neurotic Jew. I felt like that Wednesday, I'm like, lesson of 33, you get out sooner rather than later. I knew it was not going to be okay. I didn't know what was going to happen, but I knew it was not going to be okay. And my strong intuition was we leave. But at that time, we really were feeling more and more of a kind of moral obligation to stay and help mobilize the resistance. And the students were very clingy. And I felt like there were things we could do with the students and for the students. But I really did feel worn out. And I'm also a physically very cowardly person. Like, I would not hold up in prison. I've never thought I would hold up in prison. All year when I would go back and forth to New Haven and see some of my advisees and my students, I thought, what am I going to do if ICE comes into this coffee shop and tries to take this person away when I'm talking to her about her thesis? Would I fight? I want to think I would, but I don't trust myself. Would I try to pull the mask off? Would I be brave or would I be a coward? Tim is very different. Tim would have gone back after the elections, not despite, but because of them, because he would go back to fight if he had been alone. But he didn't want to do that to the kids either. And so I take full responsibility for any cowardice. We had a really, really, it wasn't, we were in a very privileged situation. The monk school offers were really, really, the monk is a really appealing place unto itself.
Of course.
It was founded by this extraordinary woman, Janice Stein, who you should also have on your podcast, who is a force of nature, and a feminist model for her generation. She's now in her 80s and she has not slowed down. She's a political scientist. She works on global security. She flits around the world every other Tuesday. She's incredibly sharp. And she created this institute as an interdisciplinary place at the university that would do very intensive scholarship that could simultaneously be public facing. So it was a very good match and a very tempting group of colleagues. So, it's not that I would say everyone should just give up everything and flee no matter what. That would not be reasonable of me. And of course, one doesn't know what's going to happen. You never know what's going to happen. And people are more or less vulnerable, depending on who they are and what they're doing. And I've seen in Ukraine too, what it meant for people to stay or to go, whether you were older, whether you were younger, were you taking care of elderly parents? Did you have children for whom else you were responsible? They're incredibly complicated decisions that people are making in agonizing circumstances.
Yeah.
I have a friend in Toronto whose daughter is married to an American and living in the States. And one of the moving things she said to me was that her grown daughter came to her and said, after the inauguration, said, "Mom, I'm just trusting you that you're going to tell me when it's time to leave."
Wow. The war they're declaring on universities, especially, I don't think people understand the full extent of what is happening across all universities right now in America. It's a total purge of intellectual freedom.
Mm-hmm. And European journalists keep saying, well, why is he going after the universities? Is he really Of course, these tyrants are going to go after universities. Masha gave what I thought was one of the best answers very early after the full-scale invasion to the question of what are the Russians really thinking? And they said, it's very difficult to determine what people are really thinking in a totalitarian regime because the whole point of a totalitarian regime is to prevent people from thinking as such. And universities are places in which we are supposed to teach people how to think and cultivate thinking. So naturally, there's a conflict of interest there. Of course, a regime like the Trump regime is not going to be on the side of the universities. That's just overdetermined.
Yeah. And plus tyrants hate go-getters in general. Yeah. That's why Stalin had to mass murder so many millions of people. It was just anybody that feels that they can take matters in their own hands and improve a park is going to roll up their sleeves and volunteer to fight off a dictatorship that is invading their homeland. It's just, there's a connection there between people that are community organizers because they operate with the spirit of agency and service, public service, which is extremely dangerous to tyrants.
Yes.
I do think this conversation ultimately made me more hopeful because you reminded me of the fact that Yanukovych tried to become president in 2004 in a fraudulent election, and the people stood up, lived in the Arctic cold in protest camps for many, many weeks. The election was overturned and they got their Western-facing candidate. But then Paul Manafort gave him a makeover and he successfully ran, became president, and started enriching himself and his family and then unleashing all of this violence on the protesters and was overthrown ultimately. So, Trump came in. We had round 1 of Trump. Now, just like with Yanukovych, we have round 2 of Trump. And it doesn't mean that what we have now is inevitable. Like you said, people can change. And as history shows, anything can happen.
If I can just put in a little plug for those community organizers. So one of the things I have just started with my fantastic colleagues, Jeff Goldfarb, a sociologist at the New School, and Jeff Isaac, who is a political scientist at Indiana University. And this was Jeff Goldfarb's idea. We have just launched a publishing project website called Small Acts of Democratic Resistance. And the idea is to document, just put it out there, the ways in which people are doing different things, even if on a small scale, even if at the level of their local park or their local library, or their local school, to resist, the fascist inclinations of this regime, and I really want it to be a space where a lot of these acts of resistance that would not rise to the level normally of international media attention or are done by, a small number of people at a local level or in a small town or people who don't necessarily have public profile, that they get some recognition. Well, it's hard to take risk. Anyone acting individually has a reason not to take a risk because it rationally and reasonably seems that the personal cost to you of this risk is greater than the overall social benefit. One of the things we can do to kind of eat away at this collective action problem is to increase the social benefit and the solidarity building effects by just having a central place to gather some of these stories. So please, listeners, if you have, I can send you the website link.
Please do. I'll link to it. Is there any risk to people? Are they exposing themselves? Is this a list that Trump's goon squad could get and be like, we're going to target these people?
That's a good question. I mean, I think anybody could be targeted in any way. People would also have a choice not to use their names, that we could craft because we're curating and mediating these stories. So we could also craft in such a way that people weren't using their names. But this is that the problem of risk is huge. It's huge. And I wrestle with it. I wrestle with it all the time. I just got emailed this morning from the Belarusian publisher of the Ukrainian Night, telling me that the Belarusian translation of Ukrainian Night has been declared extremist by Lukashenko's regime, and that now the publishing house, which is a publishing house based in Poland, Belarusian publishing house in Poland, in immigration, is particularly under scrutiny. And I thought, oh no, I hope my translator is okay. I don't know the name of my translator, which was done specifically so as not to put that person more at risk. But yes, anything like the moral dilemma of the risk that people take in order to resist I tear my hair about this every day, and it's a classic collective action problem.
But we're going to overcome it because we have no choice.
Yes, that's what I want to believe too. And I am holding on to hope. I brought children into the world, as did you. So I feel like we have to hope because that was a leap of faith that the world is going to go on.
Our discussion continues, and you can get access to that by signing up at the Truth Teller level or higher on Patreon. Discounted annual memberships are available, and you can also give the gift of membership. All summer long, Gaslit Nation, created with love and anger, has been presenting a special series featuring leading experts on how to smash the patriarchy and the oligarchy to make the world safer for everyone. Trump didn't happen overnight. Let's plant seeds of hope together. For the hottest of hot takes, join the conversation at the Gaslit Nation salons every Monday at 4 p.m. Eastern. I'll be there with our global community of listeners. Come for deep dives into the news, learn from fellow listeners, and share what's happening in your corner of the world. Can't make it live? Recordings of our Monday salons are available on Patreon, along with our monthly Gaslit Nation book club. Access the salons, bonus shows, ad-free episodes, and more at patreon.com/gaslit. That's patreon.com/gaslit. Thank you to everyone who supports the show. To help Ukraine with urgently needed humanitarian aid, join me in donating to Razom for Ukraine at razomforukraine.org. To support refugees in conflict zones, donate to Doctors Without Borders at doctorswithoutborders.org. And to protect critically endangered orangutans already under pressure from the palm oil industry, donate to the Orangutan Project at theorangutanproject.org. Gaslit Nation is produced by Andrea Chalupa. Our editing wizard is Nicholas Torres. And our associate producer is Carlin Daigle. If you like what we do, leave us a review on iTunes. It helps us reach more listeners. And don't forget to check out our Patreon. It keeps us going. Original music in Gaslit Nation is composed by David Whitehead, Martin Vissenberg, Nick Farr, Damian Arriaga, and Carlin Daigle. Our logo design was generously donated to us by Hamish Smythe of the New York-based firm Order. Thank you so much, Hamish. Gaslit Nation would like to thank our supporters at the producer level on Patreon and higher: Todd, Dan, Milo, and Cubby, Ruth Ann Harnish, Abby Zavos, Lily Wachowski, Ice Bear is Defiant, Sherry Escobar, Sydney Davies, Work for Better, Prep for Trouble, that's right, John Schoenthaler, Ellen McGirt, Larry Gasson, Ann Bertino, David East, Mark, Sean Berg, Kristen Custer, Kevin Gannon, Sandra Collins, Katie Masuris, James D. Leonard, Leo Chalupa, Carol Golstad, Marcus J. Trent, Joe Darcy, D.L. Singfield, Nicole Spear, Jans Alstrup Rasmussen, Mark, Diana Gallagher, Leah Campbell, Jared Lombardo, Randall Brewer, and Tanya Chalupa. Thank you all so much for your support of the show. We could not make Gaslit Nation without you.